get asked in the course of my day a lot about open source software and open source products. And when I try to explain it to people, they'll come to me and say, I hear that there's a free version of Office out there, or there's a free version of Photoshop out there. And, I try to explain it the best I can, well, kind of, sort of, yes and no, big asterisk on that, but for the most part. But when I try to explain, they can't wrap their head around it. They can't help but wonder what the catch is. Why is this free? Why is this product OpenOffice? Why is this product Audacity free? Didn't people spend their time and their effort and their money on developing this? And where's the payoff? So the mix of the fear of the unknown, they don't understand how the licensing scheme works, along with that distrust of no strings that we typically have, they ultimately wind up dismissing the idea. And they'll go ahead and pay the money for Office and pay the money for Photoshop. And, that may be fine based on their needs, but they might have been able to get away with an open source alternative. So I kind of wanted to come here and talk to you today about what open source is, what is the GNU GPL licensing that makes it possible, where it's already prevalent in our lives, because it's all around us, and it affects us each day whether we know it or not, and the realities of open source software, the pros and the cons, and there are cons. So it begs the question of what is open source? Well, open source, according to the Princeton WordNet system, and I like this definition, there's actually quite a few definitions out there, is of or relating to or being computer software for which the source code is freely available. Now, that begs the question, what is source code? Well, source code looks quite a bit like this. It's the instructions for a program. Before you actually compile the program that makes an application work, this is a lot of what the instructions for that might look like. It's quite algebraic, it's quite formalized, and the analogy that I like to use is, imagine if you had down the line, 50 years in the future, we have a magical food replication machine. Well, in order to make that work, you need to punch in a recipe, and that recipe has to be formatted and processed and standardized, and then all of a sudden, once you punch it into there and you compile that recipe, boom, chicken a la king. But we have companies out there like KFC that have 11 secret herbs and spices, so they don't let that go. You can't make KFC on your own. You have to buy it, and you have to buy it from them. So, source code is the instructions that make it possible for an application to be compiled and run. Now, the source code that I just showed you actually came from an open source program called PSPP. And that is an alternative to SPSS, a statistical program that's actually used quite a bit on campus here. And at the beginning of every single one of the files that make up that source code is this tag right here. And I bolded the most prominent portion of this. This library is free software. You can redistribute it and or modify it under the terms of the GNU Lesser General Public License as published by the Free Software Foundation. So, ultimately, the GNU General Public License states that the software you develop, you have the freedom to use the software for any purpose. And this has actually run afoul of many government organizations, because what if you develop software for criminal activities? But, ultimately, use it for any purpose. You have the freedom to take that software and change it any way you see fit. You can go ahead and take PSPP. You download the source code. You think you can make it better? Well, you go ahead and make it better. No one's going to stop you. The freedom to share that software with your friends and neighbors. Make copies of it. Hand it around. Install it on as many systems as you want. Don't worry about a license, or at least a license code. There is none. Just go ahead. And the freedom to share the changes that you make. If you download a program like Audacity, which is a music editing program, and you go ahead and you assign it a different toolbar, and you make it cut different, or you make the toolbar different in some manner, and you want to go ahead and distribute that, well, go right ahead. You have the freedom to do that. Now, one of the things that I had trouble personally getting my head around is, well, with this kind of limitless license, what is the difference between the GNU General Public License and nothing? Well, that's the part that was really tough for me to wrap my head around. A license, when it comes to software, is traditionally used to protect the company that made the software. The GNU General Public License actually does it slightly differently. And by slightly, I mean totally. It is there to protect the consumer. That you can't take the piece of software, I can't download the source code of Audacity, make my changes, label it something else, and then sell it and close the source code. So now people would be reliant on it. They would have to pay me $150 for my license. I'd be able to put a license key on it. They can't do that. So it isn't a free-for-all. It is there to protect the consumers so that whatever changes get made, whatever upgrades and additions and refinements get made, they would be able to have access to. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about really quickly is the concept of free software. Now, when we talk about the GNU General Public License, Linux, open source software, we, as consumers, the first thing we think about is free as in no cost. And that is not the ultimate purpose of this. The ultimate purpose of the General Public License and of open source software is to be free, not in cost, but in freedom. It's open. It's whatever we want it to be. We can redistribute it. It is free. So for the remainder of this forum, I will go ahead and actually, when I say free, I am referring to freedom. If I'm referring to cost, I will say no cost. Yes, I did censor that. And you don't want to ask me about my Google image search for that. Now, a brief history of GNU. GNU was started by Richard Stallman, who is a very interesting fellow. He wanted to provide an alternative to the closed-source Unix system. And programmers in general, especially back in the 1980s, the early 1980s, and the dawn of computers, were very odd sorts. They really, really enjoyed fixing problems, taking those problems that they just fixed after working for 12 hours at their company, taking them home, and continuing to work on them. They really took pride in the solutions that they developed and the software that they developed. But the problem is there was no such thing as an easily accessible home operating system for free, for no cost. So Richard Stallman got together with a small group of people, and they started the GNU project, which is actually a self-recursive acronym. It stands for GNU's Not Unix. And the ultimate idea was to develop as close to a Unix operating system as they could on their own terms, so that they could use that to continue working on developing more software. So the GNU project started. That right there is Richard Stallman. Looks very much like a programmer in the early 80s. In 1985, they went ahead and they started the Free Software Foundation, and they expanded. And the Free Software Foundation was developed also to generate capital, not so much for profit, but to try and, make this kind of program and this the GNU project sustainable, so that people could continue to develop into it. And so they did. They continued making programs that made an operating system work the way it does. And then 5 years later, in 1990, the GNU project had all the major components completed, except for the kernel. And let me explain that just a little bit. An operating system is composed of many, many, many different things. Text editors, formatters, programs that are designed to change directories and list directories and all these other things so that you can manipulate files. But the kernel is what really makes an operating system run. It's invisible. You never see it. It operates between the hardware and the programs. And even the overlying, what they call GUI, graphical user interface is just a program running on top of the kernel. So they had most everything done except for one of the most important bits, and that's the core of it. So along comes Linus Torvalds, who has developed the Linux kernel on his own. And because of this, now they had a completed project, and GNU/Linux system was born. Right now, ever since then, honestly, in 1991, there has been a lot of controversy internally over the name. Because Linux was so much easier to say, and it was just flowed better, it really took off as kind of the namesake of the operating system. Nobody wanted to call it GNU/Linux. It was just easier to say Linux. Well, Richard Stallman took pretty good exception to this because his project name was cut out entirely. But regardless, Linux was born. So now we have the Linux explosion happening in the early 1990s. Now, while it had a lot of internal, for lack of a better word, nerd support back in between 1991 and 1993, it was still very much a fringe operating system. Not many people gave it much credit. But when the Apache web server was developed for it, that's when businesses took notice. Before the Apache web server started, and keep in mind, this was really the dawn of the internet, you had the Microsoft IIS server running on Windows NT. And that had a pretty big restriction on it. And that restriction was that you could only run one site on one physical server at a time. If you're an ISP and you have 40,000 clients and each one of them wants a website, well, that means you need to go out and you need to buy 40,000 computers to put in your server farm. Apache changed that. Apache, you were able to run multiple sites on a single piece of hardware and for free, for no cost. So, between then and 1996, Linux distributions began to emerge. They basically took the core of the Linux GNU system and they ran with it and they developed the operating system that they wanted. That whole thing about open source being able to share, to alter and to share. And that's what they did. They altered it to base it on a particular set of ideas, of notions, of strategies that they thought were more important. They did that. They created Debian, Slackware, SUSE, Red Hat. You've probably heard of a lot of these. And by tweaking them and making them into a very particular, the Linux that they wanted, then they released them. And so these Linux distributions started to really roll out. Now this is when things really start getting interesting. Netscape, back in the dawn of the internet age, in the mid-90s, I don't know how many of you remember this, but web browsers were not free. That you couldn't download Netscape, you couldn't download Firefox, you couldn't download Chrome or any of the others. You had to go and you had to buy them. Well, not that all of those were available at the time, but you basically had two of the major players, and that was Netscape and Internet Explorer. Well, Microsoft really shook things up when they developed Windows, I think it was 95 at the time, and they included Internet Explorer on it for free. And that was huge. So now Netscape has some really bad competition. Microsoft is locking down the market. And there was a really big fear that if Microsoft Internet Explorer is the only operating system out there, well then Microsoft can go ahead and determine what the HTTP protocol and what the web standards should be. And that was a big fear. So, to answer this, Netscape went ahead and they took their project, they took their communicator, they started the open source Mozilla project, and Mozilla was the code name for Netscape, and they released the source code. So now you have a free browser that is open source, that is manipulable and redistributable. And that was a really big step toward open source and toward having some competition from Microsoft, frankly. And then in 1999, you really got Linux on the map. And that happened through VA Linux. Now, with the precursor events there, you had a lot of activity from insider industries, from the people that are more interested in the open source Netscape, deal, but you still didn't have the eye of the public. And the VA Linux IPO, when they went public, really got everybody involved because it skyrocketed. It was the development of the dot-com boom. And VA Linux actually started out as VA Research. It was a hardware company that sold computers to businesses, to individuals, and they were one of the first ones that did it exclusively with Linux pre-installed instead of Windows. And they wound up actually making quite a bit of money doing this. In 1998, they actually made $100 million in sales, and they received $5.4 million as investments from Intel and Sequoia Capital. So in 1999, they decided to go one step further. They changed their name from VA Research to VA Linux, and they started their IPO. The initial public offering was $30 a share. The highest that it went to that day was $320 a share, and it closed at $239. It was the largest IPO leap in the history of this market at the time. Unfortunately, the dot-com bubble did burst, and the expected happened. VA Linux is still around. It's called GeekNet. I believe that you may have heard of Slashdot. Well, that's GeekNet. And it trades on NASDAQ at about $25 a share. So it's still going strong, but certainly didn't have quite the rise that was sustainable. So a lot of people ask about the open source alternatives and how many of them are out there and how prevalent they are. You may have heard of a lot of these, certainly a few. But you may not have ever heard that there is an open source alternative, like SPSS to PSPP. AutoCAD and SolidWorks has FreeCAD and Archimedes. Many of you have heard of Mozilla Firefox. Well, that was what wound up being from the Netscape open source project there. I mean, granted, it was rewritten from the ground up and it had very little to do with it, but it would not have happened without that Netscape move. Microsoft Visio. A lot of people like Visio. It's not included as part of the standard Office suite. Very powerful. And there is an open source alternative. For no cost, we have Dia. Mathematica, Maple, MATLAB, we have Sage. So there is a lot of alternatives out there that are ripe for the picking. You basically do a Google search for the open source equivalent. You do a Google search for GIMP or for Audacity. It brings it up. You go right to the page, and you have two options. You can either download the program in an executable installer, or you can download the source code. So you can either run it, or you can change it. I actually found this list on osalt.com, and this is a site that's specifically designed to provide alternatives to paid or closed software. If you go there and you punch in Photoshop, it'll give you a list of compatible programs in an open source mode that will maybe meet your needs, but were essentially designed to be an alternative to Photoshop users. Now, not everything is all rosy. There are cons to open source software, and they are big ones. Keep in mind that this software is developed by advanced level users, and oftentimes they're developed for advanced level users. And there may be some hitches with that, and it primarily has to do with the learning curves involved. Not so much with learning the software, but with unlearning what you already know. So we have the learning curve due to lack of familiarity. Things in different places, buttons in different places. Maybe the tools for sorting an Excel spreadsheet are called something different in OpenOffice. There is a learning curve that comes with having to do things differently. But once you get beyond that, who knows? Learning curve due to advanced functionality. A lot of times, like I said, these are advanced users that they are being targeted. So a lot of the soft touch layman's terms might not even be included, might not have ever been considered by the people writing the software. So it can take some time to really learn how to use these things. How many people here have used GarageBand for Apple? All right. Audacity is very similar, but it is hard to learn. It is a pain. But once you get the hang of it, once you get really everything down, then it's not so bad. But the learning curve is significant. Learning curve due to bad design. Well, some things are just made poorly. You may have Wii in version 0.0.1, and other people haven't taken the mantle and run with it yet. This could be infant software, so it might have a lot of bugs. It might have a lot of refinements, and there is that risk. And the lack of formal support, that is something that is very key, especially on an enterprise level. The ability to call technical support is a huge plus in the world of paid or closed applications. And even if that support is lackluster, even if you wait for 2 hours and get on the phone and it's somebody with an Indian accent, it is still support. If you're using open source products, especially on enterprise level, especially on server levels, who do you call? You just downloaded the source code, you modified it, you compiled it, it's meant for your organization. There's no one. There's yourself or your organization. Now, there are companies out there that have actually made a pretty good living providing support specifically for open source enterprise. You know, if you have source code that's really well documented, they'll go in and they'll try to help you out. But ultimately, a vendor-specific support system is ultimately relied on by the users, by discussion groups, by forums, by other people that have gone through the same problems that you have and have found their own solutions. That's basically it. Now the pros, obviously no cost, typically. And I kind of want to go into that just a little bit. And it has a lot to do with what I just said about the support. On an enterprise level, support is never free, especially when you're providing it on your own. Because the amount of time that it takes to pay employees to dive into your source code and to try and debug programs, that can be really significant. You're not only pulling them off of other projects, but it just takes so much time to really try and troubleshoot these things and to really dive in and figure out where the problem lies. And especially when you're dealing with open source software on an operational level that is specifically customized either by yourself or by an external entity for your organization. If it is something that is unique to your company or unique to your needs that has been developed specifically for you, then that takes a lot of manpower to try and maintain. Every upgrade is done biting fingernails. Advanced functionality for advanced users. That can be a real plus for geeks. We love things like that. So that's a pro in my book, but I recognize that that's not necessarily a pro in a lot of people's books. Potentially large support resources from peers. The peer pool is something that is not to be dismissed, especially when we're talking about programmers, especially when we're talking about open source programmers. These are individuals, like I mentioned earlier, that do this in their spare time. They do it to bring home a paycheck, then they go home, and they continue doing it. They really know their stuff, and they're really good about helping people. It's not unheard of to bring an issue to a forum, and for them to say, okay, go ahead and run this debugging program, send me your log files, I'll go ahead and pore over it, and this is, Saturday at 3 p.m. This guy just wants to help you out. There's something to be said for that. There's a really big community involved. And the nature of open source does mean strong peer review. By having a product that is open and out there and exposed, you have the reviews of your peers to fall back on. And if you fall down on the job, you can bet, especially if the need that you were filling was great, that somebody will pick that up and run with it on their own. Strong peer review typically does mean strong software. So this is some of the open source that already exists in our world. Google. Google is one of the strongest contenders out there, and they use open source all the time. They actually switched to Linux, to open source for their employees on an enterprise infrastructure level. Now when they bring in new employees, they give them two options. Do you want OS 10 on a Mac, or do you want Linux on a PC? Because they don't want Windows in their system. Android. A lot of phones are coming out with Android now. I personally have my eye on the Motorola Zoom. And that was open source, developed by Google. Department of Defense, FAA, United States Postal Service, the Naval Submarine Fleet, governments, cities, a lot of places are already implementing open source, and they've done so in the last most of it has happened within the last 5 to 6 years. Weta Digital, that was actually a really good example there. They did the science, the special effects behind Lord of the Rings, Avatar, King Kong, a lot of the major movies out there. They're a big contender with ILM, and they use a lot of open source internally. If you don't have knowledge of Linux, then you aren't getting a job there. So, at this time, I'd like to go ahead and open up for discussion. If anybody has any questions out there, I'd love to try and answer them. But okay.